lost one of its elder statesmen earlier this week, a legend, John Romita. And first and foremost, I want to thank this entire panel of creators and friends who were willing to, very last minute, understandably, take time out of their schedule at the convention this weekend to come and take part in this. So I just want to do a quick rundown of who we've got up here to weigh into their thoughts, memories, etc. of John Romita. So down the end, we've got Rick Leonardi, artist, Spider-Man 2099, among so many other things. Chris Claremont, who has got too many writing credits to mention, but you may have heard of the X-Men. Next to him is Joey, who is John Romita Jr.'s stepson, so we're a big family. We've got Bill Morrison next, who's former editor-in-chief of Mad, Bongo Comics, among other credits. We've got Ron Wilson, you might know from The Thing, Marvel 2-in-1, again, among many other credits. And next we've got Susan Loeb, who worked with John back in the 50s, is that it?
Oh,
the
no, 60s.
60s, sorry. That's a bad mistake. But on the Marvel Romance comics, she was the writer of the Susan Says advice column back in those. And then on the end, we've got Aaron Sultan, who is an art collector, but was also friends with John, known him for decades, and he actually bought some samples or copies of the John Romita original artwork that he owns from his collection. So again, thank you all for being willing to take part in this. And anyone can jump in, whoever wants to go first, but I think the first most obvious question is, what was your first either meeting or interaction or influence of John or first impression? And again, whoever wants to jump in first, by all means.
I'll go first. I actually have no business being on this panel, other than I gave John Romita Sr. his proudest moment in comics, according to him. And the way this came about, I'm known mostly for doing humor and things like The Simpsons and Futurama, but I always wanted to be a superhero artist. And unfortunately, I didn't have the nerve to move from Detroit to New York because I thought New York was too dangerous. Figure that out. I grew up in Detroit. But that was my thinking in art school, so I kind of went the other way and I went out to California. So maybe in another universe I would have been a Romita's Raider. But that didn't happen. But he was a big influence on me and my art. And when I started doing Simpsons comics, I'd like to pay tribute to the artists that I admired. So I did, a number of Steranko parodies, and it was great with The Simpsons because you could parody comic covers, and the fans would get it, and they would, get a kick out of seeing, Simpsons characters in place of Captain America or Batman or whatever. So I did this cover for a Bartman comic, and it was a parody of, in the story, Bartman quits being Bartman. So the cover was a parody of Spider-Man number 50. And so, I did that in, I think, 1994. A couple of years later, Wizard Magazine did this special issue that was the 100 greatest comic book covers. And I pick up the book because I was curious, and I'm flipping through, and I get to number 1, and it's Spider-Man number 50. And they interviewed John about the cover. And in the interview, he said, the proudest moment of my career was when The Simpsons did a parody of this cover. And I'm sitting there reading this going, oh my God, that's me. I gave John Romita the proudest moment of his career. I was thunderstruck. I couldn't believe it. And a couple of years later, I got to meet him at the Cartoon Art Museum. I knew I was going to see him. And so I did a recreation of the cover, and I presented it to him, of the Bartman cover. And I let him know that him saying that The Simpsons doing a parody of his cover was the proudest moment of his career. Me reading that was the proudest moment of my career. And to this day, I think about that and just marvel at it, and to be able to work in comics and to you know, I would have loved to have worked with John and known him better, but to have that moment where, you know, something I did influence such a great artist was incredible, and you know, I'll always cherish that.
Who else would like him? I will admit I don't know how well all of you necessarily knew John or worked with him, but I mean, also I'm sure that the artists here in the room probably were influenced in him or by him in some way. So, Rick, you look like you've got something to say.
I mean, is that right? Whoever wants to go. Here we go. This is us doing a tea party image. Yeah, so I grew up obviously reading Spider-Man, and the Spider-Man I was reading was his issues, swapping them back and forth with my buddies and tracing them, which I guess is a terrible sin, but what did we know back then? The day I was hired, though, finally in 1980, as a kind of welcome aboard gesture, I was brought into his office. He was then unofficial art director at Marvel. And I sat down, and I was obviously in awe, and so tongue-tied I couldn't speak, but for 20 minutes he gave me just some of the soundest and most generous, most encouraging advice I've got from anybody ever. One of the things he told me, that sticks with me to this day, is to try, in penciling comics as a kind of a survival technique, trying to have 20 or 30 what he called repertory panels at your disposal, panels that you could do in your sleep, panels that always work, panels that that you don't have to think too much about. It will advance the story. And what that meant for him was that one panel per page out of the 5 or 6 should be a panel that was a stretch. It was kind of a reach for you, a kind of an artistic endeavor. And that was the way to survive in business. That was the way to be fast. And I remember this advice to this very day. And the reason, and I think about it, I think about him telling me this about roughly every day, because every day I try and follow that advice and fail. Every panel for me is a struggle. But I always remember Romita telling me that was the path. Between them, John and his wife Virginia, who was at that same time what they call the traffic manager. She was in charge of scheduling, keeping everybody on deadline. Between the two of them working there at Marvel, the company seemed, to me anyway, to be a family, a welcoming place to work. And I was pretty lucky that way.
Susan, you again, as we covered, worked with him in the 60s.
Yeah, the late 60s.
But can you talk a little bit about how your, well, first, when you first met John, but also kind of how your professional relationship worked?
My honor to be asked to sit on this panel, and my honor to have known John Romita Sr. A gentleman from the word go. I mean, this guy was the real thing, genuine. When I worked at Marvel, there were 3 large rooms. One room was the bullpen. It consisted of Tony Martellero, John Romita, Marie Severin, and Herb Trimby. The second area was Saul Brodsky, Roy Thomas, and me. And the third area was Stanley's office. And there was a small area where they had what was called back then mimeograph machines, back in the day. When Marvel decided to do the resurgence of Love Comics, Stan obviously did not want to do Stan Soapbox because this was girly magazines, right? Seeing as I was the only girl in the office, the only woman in the office other than Marie, who was busy doing Submariner, writing a column, an advice to the Lovelorn column fell into my lap. So I was in the right place at the right time. John, whether he liked it or not, was assigned the task of doing my logo. He made me look like Mary Jane, which to this day, I mean, to me is just such an honor. Also, when it came to doing my signature at the bottom, I was afraid I was gonna mess it up. So I wrote my name on a piece of paper and John recreated my signature. This went on, I mean, I did 10 issues, and what was most notable to me is on my 2 very first editions, it was Johnny Romita who did the artwork, which is just phenomenal. With the exception of Roy Thomas and myself, unfortunately, most of the people who sat in that bullpen are gone. Herb Trimby died, Tony died. What? You weren't in the bullpen with me, were you?
No, I was sitting next to you for 2 months, yes.
For 2 months.
In 69.
Memorable. I'm
I
just
know, I didn't say that, I just walked in and walked out.
I mean, I'm single, you're not wearing a wedding band, how would I not know that?
Because it's summer and it doesn't fit me.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so, getting back to this, I had the honor of meeting John Jr. last year at the convention because I wanted to make the connection. I wanted to show John Jr. the work that his dad had done, which has been reproduced through the years. And I had a discussion with John Jr. and I said, you know, I remember when I was getting married, your father took me on the side and said, I have some advice that I want to give you. Well, this is John Romita and he's going to give me advice. This is going to be so great. This is going to stay with me the rest of my life. And the words that he said to me were, don't get fat. Interestingly enough, when I told this to John Jr., he said, damn, that's exactly what Dad told me when I was getting So this is the kind of humor that the bullpen experienced. Do you remember that? Okay, you do. Work got done. It did not matter. Raucous laughter all over the place. And most importantly, no egos, including Stan. I mean, these were genuine people. And as I said, this was the beginning before the explosion of what we know Marvel Comics to be now. And it was like a mom and pop store, a mom and pop business. And that's the kind of relationship, and those are wonderful memories that I am blessed to have experienced. And thank you for letting me share that all with you.
Thank you for sharing. Chris, now that you've raised your hand, what was it like coming in the bullpen then there in the late 60s?
Well, first you had to get past John Verporten, who makes the Hulk look small, who made the Hulk look small. No, I mean, that was it. You walked into the bullpen and you had John, you had Herb, you had Marie, and Tony, and it was like, it was a hangout space. Stupidly, I would hang out behind Marie, which is like the next best thing to get hi Godzilla, do you mind if I, no, God! Marie did not take people looking over her shoulder lightly. And the thing was, John was, in a way, the characterizational anchor of the space. You know, whatever you needed, he depended on. I mean, he could provide. One of the early books that I fell in love with was Daredevil. And, you know, he had a way of presenting him that was just cool to my eye. And when he moved on to Spidey, it was like, for those, you know, you get used to looking at Ditko's Peter Parker, and the quintessential geek was Peter. I mean, he wore a bow tie, he had glasses, he wore a vest, for God's sake. And I mean, this is high school in the 60s. What were you asking for? And yet, every so often, Gwen Stacy would look at it and there would be something there. And then John came in and Peter got a motorcycle. He took off his glasses. He suddenly went to the gym between panels and looked really, really cool. And, you know, with Steve, you couldn't figure out how Spidey beat anybody because he was just this little willowy figure. And then with John, oh, okay, now it makes sense. He, you know, he just does everything. And when he took a step up in becoming art director, again, he was the fulcrum around which the entire machine revolved. It's like, if you needed help, he was there to give it. If you needed advice, he was there to provide it. If you needed refuge from Virginia, he would shut his door and just, I'm not here. Because, you know, it's like, if you're up against Virginia, you're on your own, kid. But whatever was asked of him, he would provide it. You need a design for, I don't know, Wolverine. Whoop, there it was. You need a cover, notes on a cover. It was there. If you're a new kid coming in off the street, you would sit down and tell you the reality of things, but in a way that made you feel welcome. And of all the people I've ever known in this business, he is pretty much the only one about which nobody has anything negative to say. He was a decent, honorable guy whose art was the perfect exemplar of his character. You look at it and you thought, this is cool. It wasn't even that there was nothing flashy about it. You just wanted to turn the page to see what happened next. He didn't need to call attention to himself by drawing brilliantly with lots of little lines to demonstrate Spidey's web power. He just drew the character. And to turn the pages was to see the story evolve before your eyes. And as a reader, that was all you needed. And again, meeting him was, in a weird sort of way, especially when you were a young punk just starting out. Oh, this is how dads should be. I get it. And he moved on from there.
Well, as Chris just mentioned, you know, John was the art director at Marvel for many. What?
You need more volume.
I'll just talk.
Yes.
Here we go.
Oh, just listen harder.
But John was the art director at Marvel for many years, and Ron, you're also on the art side of things. I don't know if there was overlap between his time as art director and when you started working, but do you have any art related, you know, whether it's influence or words of advice or anything? Like that?
Just to piggyback off of Chris, John Romita was unsung.
Was what?
Unsung.
Yes.
But he was heralded by the pros professionals. We knew the depth of his talent. And I'm here to say, where do I begin? But I'm going to begin at my beginning. And Frank Giacomo was the art director of Marvel at that time. And at that time, they was accepting personal interviews. So you can go and knock on the door, and you gotta keep knocking. You keep knocking. And I was a nuisance kid. And I couldn't be told no for an answer. So Frank Giacomo showed Stanley my samples. And I didn't see Stanley. He was like Oz. You get a chance to see him, but you knew he was behind that door, that magic door. And he told Frank Giacomo that I was 6 months old. And I waited exactly 6 months. So when I tried to get in at Marvel again, well, they weren't accepting no more personal interviews. You had to mail your work in. And I waited exactly 6 months and mailed my work in. But I didn't hear a thing. And that was my first year of college. So I waited and waited. And I said, well, I better make this phone call. And I went down to the phone booth outside of the college I attended. And I called Marvel, and John picked the phone up. Amazing. So he said in his animated voice, hey kid, I've been meaning to call you, but things been so busy up here. So he said, I want you to come up, I want to talk to you. And boy, that phone booth put a shot to me. So I went up there and he introduced me to Marvel and Don McGregor. And that's how I got my first job. Dr. Jekyll, I don't know how to remember the book, but it was like a 7-pager because it wanted to test your storytelling, your sequential art skills. And I never drew a story in my life. But somehow I loved it in my element, and everything just fell in place. And that's how I met John Romita, and he changed my life forever. And I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for that man.
Aaron, I want to move over to you because you are kind of singular on this panel that you went, I assume, from fan to collector to friend. So I just, talk a little bit about, how you got to actually meet and know, this creator who I assume you were following for all these years. I mean, much like the rest of us. And also, like I said, you brought examples of the original art that you collect. So I'm actually going to set the mic down, and if you want me to kind of walk around and show it as you're talking, if there's anything you want me to point to, just let me know, and we'll let everyone get a chance to kind of take a look at that.
Sure. So, growing up, as from a fan's perspective, I absolutely adored John's artwork. What's interesting is when I was a kid, I don't know if anybody else can identify with this, but I knew who Stan Lee was, and I knew who John Romita was, but I really didn't pay attention to the creators that were doing these comic books. But there was something that hit me hard. I can recall back in the late '60s and the '70s. I remember as I was reading the comics and seeing this art, there was something about the art that made me think, the guy that's drawing this must be an incredible person. And it was because there was such a clear delineation of good versus evil that was being done. And I thought, the person that did this, they must be of upstanding character. And you just heard on the panel here the testimonies of John being an unsung hero, and nothing negative ever said about him. And I had that interpretation, believe it or not, as a 10-year-old kid, reading and looking at John's art. So fast forward into the 90s, I had my first job, had a little bit of money in my pocket, and I was finishing my Spider-Man collection. I thought it would be really cool to get a piece of art that John did. Like, how do you do that? So back in the 90s, the only way to really do that, if anybody remembers, was the Comics Buyer's Guide. And so I started taking out these little ads. John Romita pages wanted, any art, any issue, any whatever. I was pleading to somebody, give me a chance to have one. So I finally was able to get a few things, and then I found out that John was going to be attending one of the national conventions in New York in the 90s, and I went up there, and it's just, this is a thing where it gets, I can't put my finger on it. But as I'm walking around and, just a fan amongst thousands of fans there, somebody, one of the handlers there must have heard that I was interested in John's work and so forth, and they came up to me and says, hey, look, I need you to help me. John's gonna be pulling up, there's a driver bringing him to this convention. Can you take this placard that says John Romita and go out there and stand on the street so that when he pulls up, yeah, of course. So I go out there and I'm waiting and have to admit my heart's beating a little bit quick out there. And he pulls up and he gets out and he walks over and he says, hey kid, I'm like 35 at the time. What's your name? And I said, I'm Aaron Sultan. And I was surprised he even acted that interested. He goes, are you the guy that keeps advertising the CBG for my stuff? and almost a little perturbed. And I said, yeah, it's me. But anyway, what was interesting was for the rest of that weekend, especially when he would go out there and sit down for the fans to line up. He would ask me to come over and sit next to him. He said, look, when those fans, the ones that walk up with the long boxes filled with their comic, they want me to sign everything. Help me out here a little bit, okay? And so it was a little bit of a gatekeeper that weekend for John. And then, yeah, we exchanged phone numbers, and from there on, just really enjoyed getting to know him. A couple things just to share that are a little off the beaten path was in one of our phone conversations, we discovered our love for Frank Capra movies. And John absolutely loved, most of us have seen it, It's a Wonderful Life. He loved that. He loved Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And so that began like a 15-year period. We would trade DVDs in the mail. I would send him something that he might not have seen and so forth. I remember one time I was talking to him and he goes, did you like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? And I said, oh yeah, it's one of Jimmy Stewart's favorites and everything. And he said, the guy that plays the villain in there, Edward Arnold, by the way, not to be confused with Eddie Arnold from Green Acres. Edward Arnold, anybody in this room, look up Edward Arnold on your phone, because John, to me, drops a bombshell. He says, that's the Kingpin. That's who I designed the Kingpin of. And it was just little anecdotes like that over the years. He would write me letters where he would tell me something that was just a nuance, something that nobody really knew. He told me that all the people in the Marvel offices, Susan was talking about, Herb Trimpe and Tony and all those folks, Herb and Marie, they all laughed at him because that cover to Amazing Spider-Man 75, Death Without Warning, where he's got his hand, they said, you made his head look like a watermelon. And those are the things that John carried around. Those are the stories that were just so beloved that he carried around with him. So anyway, it was just a joy. One final footnote. John would watch he loved sentimental movies, as I was mentioning, and he loved them. And he would say, yeah, I cried in that. I saw that one. It brought me to tears. And years later, my good friend Dewey Cassell's in the audience here. We were working on the Marie Severin book together, and Dewey and I we would go up to visit Marie at her nursing home. And one time we're up there, and she was saying, "How's Johnny Romita doing? Have you talked to him lately?" And I said, "Yeah." And somehow we got on the track of these movies, these Frank Capra movies. And I was saying, and I was almost tearing up. Yeah, he would watch Mr. Smith, and You Can't Take It With You, and yeah, all those both made us cry. And Marie, being the non-sentimental type, she's listening to this, and she had not lost any of her not Brand X humor, even at 85 when we were talking. She goes, "Well, of course he cried. He's Italian." So, anyway, the thing that was the big takeaway is just how much they enjoyed being with each other. They created their own humor in those offices, and it was a joy to get a little glimpse into that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those stories. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have Joey here, who's a member of the family. And I don't know if there's anything that you want to, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm sure it's been a very difficult week for the family.
Yeah.
But if there is anything that you'd like to share, stories or
Yeah.
thoughts, and obviously you've been in touch with your stepdad, John Jr., if there's anything that
Of
you
course.
want to share with the family as well.
First of all, I just want to say thank you guys so much for coming here. It means a lot to me and my family to be able to be here representing them. I'm not used to being up here and talking, usually my dad, so it's a little different for me, but it's been a big hard week for us, but I'm just happy to see everyone here and supporting my family. Some stories I can tell you about John and my step-grandma. She's definitely a hard ass. And the first time I ever met her, I never will forget it. I came in her house and she yelled at me for not taking my shoes off, not eating her food, and pretty much just shook my hand and said, "Nice to meet you." I was 11 years old. That was 26 years ago. So I'll never forget that day. And it's their relationship, just like he was just saying, is a joy to see. And she still even was cracking jokes just last week when I talked to her, and she's in good spirits and everything. Obviously it's a big hard week for us, but I'm just happy to be able to be here, and obviously John wishes he can be here, but obviously for other circumstances I'm just happy that they invited me to be here with you guys.
And again, thank you for so much for being here. So obviously this is a tribute panel. We want to pay tribute to John, and we've heard, of all these folks, who worked with him, knew him in real life, but also, the other half of comics is the fans. I assume you're in this room because you're familiar with his work, grew up reading it perhaps, or doing it. And since we've got, a member of the family here, does anyone in the audience have anything they want to say that enjoyed it and take back to the family and share?
We used to talk to your father, past, so we used to speak to him quite often at San Diego Comic. He's a very nice man, and he was,
Thank you so much.
I think he was a class act.
Very much so.
I'm getting a word back today.
I am.
Well, I want to make sure everyone can hear.
Huge fan of John Romita Sr. and Jr. I've got to ask about the panel. You know what I'm talking about, the one where Mary Jane is introduced, which is etched on many minds of people my age who first saw it when it was published. Did he ever talk about that panel? I know, Susan, you talked about how he kind of made you look a little like Mary Jane, but that was pre-Mary Jane, right? Was it?
She had just been introduced.
Okay. But did he ever talk about that panel? Yes.
Not me.
I'll just mention, so originally this time slot was supposed to be panel with John Jr. and Howard Mackey, and so this slot was in, and I was already honored to be moderating that panel, but so even though I sort of fell into this, I am honored to be able to do this as well, because John Romita Jr. That's my spider, or John Romita Sr. rather, is my spider. I grew up in the 80s reading Marvel Tales reprints, Ditko and Romita, but that is to me the definitive Spider-Man. I remember when the trailers came out for Civil War and Spider-Man drops down, I literally stood up out of my chair in excitement. I was like, he's got Romita eyes. I was so excited. So
I remember that. I did.
But how can you tell through the nose?
One thing I'll say about John's work was that as a kid, and a kid who had artistic ability and was starting to think about wanting to be a comic book artist, it was so appealing. And I think about the artists that I gravitated toward, and they're all, like, how many of you are Karl Barks fans? Okay, got a pretty good handful. So he was known as the good duck artist. And that was because when they didn't get credits, back in the 40s and 50s, before Marvel kind of started pioneering, let's make sure everybody gets credits on the stories. Nobody knew who this guy was. They didn't know his name was Karl Barks, but they recognized that he was the artist who drew the Donald Duck stories better than anybody else. Same with Dan DeCarlo with Archie Comics. Sometimes his name was on the work, sometimes not, but people gravitated towards his art because it was appealing and it had like a certain magic. And for me as a kid, those three artists, Carl, Dan DeCarlo, and John, kind of stand out in my mind, thinking back as a kid, not knowing who they were, but recognizing the brilliance of it. There was something appealing and something magical that you couldn't really put your finger on, especially as a kid. I didn't have the skills to, put anything like that into words. I barely have it today. But he had that spark, that magic, that whether you knew who he was or not, you could look at anything you drew and go, wow, there's something special about that.
I just want to say a couple things about John Romita and how it touches me personally. I mean, as a person who got into reading comics primarily in the late 70s and through the 80s, I think during that time period, I probably took John Romita Sr.'s artwork kind of for granted. Kind of like I did Kurt Swan's Superman and Jimmy Paro's Batman, because there was such a body of work, and at that point, he'd been doing it so long, and yes, he may not have been the then hot name, but he was always there, and so much of that body of work was there, you know, was drawn by those artists and informed the coming artists after that. But I know from a personal standpoint, when I would start to go to comic conventions, primarily they were Orlando Con in Florida, because I'm from the Tampa area. From a personal standpoint, I could go look back at those convention experiences, and there are two individuals who just stand out as the most friendly and genuine and individuals, professionals that I ever had the opportunity to meet, and one was George Perez, and the other was John Romita. And it'll always stand out that beyond being these marvelous, no pun intended, these wonderful artists, they were genuine good people, and it came across, and they were interested in you. And that also came across when I would hear him talk about in interviews his own kind of his own humility. Like when he took the job for Spider-Man, who are you gonna get to draw that? I mean, who can follow Ditko? Oh, you, me. You know, that comes across that he didn't have that kind of ego. And even in the later years when I'd hear podcasts with him with other artists, and they would all be asking him, and he would answer the questions, and then they'd answer the other artists who were quite a bit younger, and you could hear in his voice that he was as interested in hearing about these young and incoming artists as everyone else. When they were like, well, this is John Romita, I'm sitting there playing, you know, he's excited to hear about what I'm doing, and it all just came across, and that's when I think of John Romita Sr., I always think about.
This gentleman just mentioned, you know, just the body and the body of work behind. So I'd kind of like to run back through the panel here, and maybe is there a favorite standout, whether that's a story, a cover, even a panel, you know, that is a favorite or a standout for you. So we'll start with you, Rick, and we'll run down the line. You sat on the end, you did this yourself.
Well, as a kid, as I say, trading them back and forth with my friends, the sequence in Spider-Man where the Fred Foswell arcs, where, for example, Spider-Man is in the water chamber, tied up with Jonah Jameson, and the chamber's filling with water and all that kind of stuff. I remember that very distinctly. Those were great stories. But later, the thing that was most impressive to me was when Gil Kane came aboard and started drawing Spider-Man as the penciler and John inked him. I thought, this is an interesting switch. But in a way, and I may be totally off base about this, but it seems to me that in a lot of ways, this liberated John style, his inking attack was completely different from what you would expect from the pencils that you've seen. Quite a bit more gesture, a lot heavier, a lot more fun to look at. And I'd have read those books right through to the end. Unfortunately, they decided to kill Gwen Stacy, and that was the end of my reading career. But that was after John. I think John was off by then. John was all good again, I think. But yeah, I don't know whether that speaks to his relative lack of inflated ego that he was able to ink Gil Kane with equanimity, but it was great work.
Chris, something that jumps out for you?
I mean, guess my challenge is, I thought Spider-Man was cool. For me, the FF was the magic book. John's 2 or 4 issues, transitioning from Jack to John Buscema it's like they gave him the toughest job in the industry. You know, oh, lucky you get to follow Jack Kirby. And he did it. And he did a really good job, but it wasn't quite the style of characters that maybe he was comfortable with, because the FF were always this larger than life science fiction reality. And John was always came across reading him that this is down to earth Queens back alley kids, totally out of their league. I mean, the whole thing, that was what was so, in a way, memorable about Peter getting his bike, is it was him stepping out from high school in Queens and going across the river to Manhattan, where, of course, there were bigger buildings for him to swing off, thank goodness. He'd have a great time now. But John this is why the series that actually got me hooked on John was Daredevil, because you had this insane sense of, wow, this idiot's holding on to, a string 40 stories up, you know, wearing sort of like at least sensible shoes. Unlike Spider-Man, it's like at least he has soles on him. And thank God he's blind, because if you could see what he was doing, he would go like, ah, because I'm reading the thing and I'm going, ah. John put you into the moment, but it was a real world moment. And he conveyed this wonderful sense of Peter being totally out of his depth and knowing it, and yet finding a way to win regardless. That, picking up from Ditko and moving on, and suddenly, you know, Mary Jane walks into his life, and in a way she's like the total 60s girl, but in a way she also was like just as unapproachable as Mary Jane, as Gwen, because Peter was at that stage in his life when he couldn't figure, you know, I'm living in my own little apartment in the middle of nowhere. I'm struggling to make a way in the world, and I'm Spider-Man, and everything I touch blows up in my face, and I don't want to hurt or lose either of these girls, but I can't get away from them. And it's like,
well, maybe, you know, it's interesting to hear the contact that he had with romance comics. And, you know, maybe there's a strand of that intimacy and that personal level storytelling that comes through, that's really where he lives and where he's more comfortable.
I mean,
the kind of world-ending Galactus story that Jack was specialized in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see John maybe doing that.
No, John, he was totally down to earth. I mean, he was the yang of Marvel. Jack was the yin, where, you know, fortunately Stan kept it readable, but you look at New Gods and you look at FF and you could see Jack just was, you know, essentially telling Lucasfilm how to do it. They just hadn't figured it out yet. Whereas John was 1940s Warner Brothers backlot. You look at that, and he was creating this world that as a reader you could identify with, because, okay, can't stick to walls, but I can definitely walk down the street and stuff happens. And you deal with it. And in a way, that's the hardest
I
thing.
can see him being a parent.
They're jumping.
I've seen 3 movies. No, I just gonna say that the thing is, in a world, in a comic book reality where everything is going more and more over the top, he was grounded in the best sense of the word. And for a lot of readers, at least for me back then, that was enough. You know, I didn't, you know, because what I was doing was falling for the characters. What I was doing was wanting to see how it would work out between him and Glenn, or between him and MJ, or just between him and Harry, for God's sakes. Will they be friends? That meant a lot. That was the antithesis of what was being offered from other companies, where it was just billionaires in costumes, or strange people from another world who had no problems. This was, I mean, he was, to me, the artist who epitomized Stan's idea is that we're not telling stories about suits. We're telling stories about people who, when they go to work, put on a skin-tight costume. But they're people. The people are what matter. And the people were what John was so gifted at presenting. And what, in a lot of ways, he passed on to Johnny.
Did you ever have the opportunity to work with him as the artist on something you wrote?
No. He's in my 5, you know, didn't work with him, didn't work with Jack, didn't work with Neil. Damn it. On the other hand, I have 4 characters who, you know, he came in, gave notes, and suddenly Logan was Logan, and you know, you grab it and move on. And all other things notwithstanding, it didn't matter what working with him, talking with him.
Kind of wearing my favorite already on my shirt, big tribute. Also too, just the tribute too that my dad did with my grandpa, the recent comic book, with Spider-Man No More. That was a really touching image, and I think that it represented. I was really happy to have my grandpa be able to see that too before, and it's an amazing cover, and I'm just really happy to see it. I'm loving hearing everyone else's inputs too as well, so please.
This is, by the way, another one I ripped off for Simpsons Comics, for issue 3. Not the figure in the center, but I had like all the negative faces in the background on the cover, with Bart and Lisa in the middle. So obviously that one and the Spider-Man 50, up 2 of the big ones.
It was the thing I could never understand. He only had one outfit. And how did he keep it clean?
Good question. I love the one.
I understand he learned sewing.
Yeah.
But it was just like, again, you look at the movie, all the things we take for granted today in terms of the movie pictures version, in terms of, this is back in the dawn of time when it was just a kid wearing tights and leotards.
Do you remember the storyline where Jameson got his mask and he had to buy a store-bought Spider-Man mask?
Yep.
And it didn't have the reflective eyes, so you could actually see Peter's eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how many times have we ripped that off? Over and over. Even, that was where, no, I was thinking this is where, second movie Spider-Man, Andrew
Garfield.
Garfield. Another Jewish person. Anyway, walks on stage at San Diego, or sneaks on stage and is like, "Hi, I want to be Spider-Man" in the costume contest. And everyone thinks, who's this geek? And then it's revealed, this is the next Spider-Man. And, you know, there you go.
Well, one that stands out for me, you mentioned the Hammerhead story. So I was like 13, 14 years old. And they came out with this album, Spider-Man, a rock comic. And John Romita did all the art. He did the cover, he did these illustrations of like Luke Cage and like Captain America and Spider-Man all like playing guitar and drums and stuff. Which is, like, I look at it now, it's pretty dorky, but I thought it was really cool back then. And I mean, John made it look fantastic. And the storyline, the album has like a radio drama, like a serialized story with Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And so the local radio station, actually across the river in Canada from Detroit, they were playing that all weekend long on Easter weekend, this one year. And I had to hear it. Like, the album hadn't come out yet, and they're advertising that, you know, they're gonna play this. So they would play a song from it, from the album, and then they would play a chapter of this story. And it was like listening to, you know, like old time radio. It was great. And it was a beautiful weekend. I had friends coming over saying, come on, we're gonna play football in the field. No, I gotta stay home, I gotta listen to this Spider-Man story. They thought I was nuts. And there was a call-in, like every hour, they would say, third caller to call in wins the Spider-Man rock comic album, a comic book, and a poster. And I was at the phone, like at the ready every time. I knew when they were gonna call it, and I dial it. You know, we didn't have push buttons, so I would dial it, and I did. You know, every time I didn't get it, and finally it's like 6 o'clock on Sunday night. It's like the last chapter, and I got in, and they said, "You're the winner. You won the album and the comic and the poster." And I was like, it was all worth it. Like, you know, being a hermit for the whole weekend, it was all worth it. And so that, you know, it comes in the mail. I got the album and the poster, put it on my wall. And the comic book was the Hammerhead one. And I think it had just come out. And I was following, you know, Spider-Man comics at the time, and reading that whole storyline was great. And then my dad was an insulation contractor, and he was doing a job at a record store. And they had a big standee of Spider-Man by John. You know, it was like a big giant. It was like the image from the album cover, but cut out, die cut. And he brought that home one day, and I had that in my bedroom for years. You know? So I guess that's probably what stands out the most for me.
Well, how about you?
I'll make this short and sweet for the rest of the panel members to speak. My thoughts and prayers go out to the Romita family. And speaking of radio, you ever heard a song growing up? You know exactly what you were doing, you know exactly how old you were, where you were at. So with me, it's quite simple. John Romita, we introduced the Green Dot. I knew how old I was, where I was at, what book stand I bought the book from, and that was my moment as far as growing up and falling in love with home.
I'm going to share something very personal with you, and I don't know how many of you know this, but in the bullpen, we had nicknames for each other. I won't tell you what mine was, but I will tell you John Romita's nickname was Papa John. And that's what we called him. And speaking to all of your points, you all know how you feel about your Papa. Well, he was Papa John, and I'm sharing that with you, and I don't know how many people really ever knew that.
Can we get the Romitas to sue the pizza company? Yeah.
I always thought Romita was a master at giving me and probably millions of fans the tension of, oh my gosh, somebody's gonna figure out who Peter Parker is, that he's Spider-Man. And I mean, this went on for, you know, all those years, childhood years of, is that identity, is that gonna, you know, are we gonna spill the beans on that? My first copy, or my first issue of Spider-Man was number 87. And that scene recapping issue 12, where he is unmasked, I just remember saying, how in the world is he gonna get out of this? And I just was mesmerized by this panel, which recapped Ditko's issue number 12. That was number one, is a thing that stuck out. The second thing was the drug issues. People may recall issues 96 through 98. That was a whole controversy in itself, and you probably know all about that. But that page where, and this is to me the beginning of the end, because this was the seed that was planted that would eventually become Gwen, the thing with Gwen. But where they're heading off in the back of that theater, and Spider-Man goes back there, his spider sense is tingling, and he needs to go, he's got to figure out what's going on. He goes back to the theater, he goes into this closet, and there's the Green Goblin in there, as Ron was saying, and he's saying, Parker, he calls him Parker, and Spider-Man is absolutely freaking out here. He knows who I am. He knows who I am. And I just remember that the tension was unbelievable. And John was a master at building that tension. And then, Ron, you also said you remember where you were when you saw the Green Goblin. I remember exactly where I was. I was in the top bunk of my bed, and I was reading issues 121 and 122. And I just remember not wanting to even go to sleep. I couldn't believe what I read. Was Gwen Stacy dying, and then, you know, the square off with the Green Goblin. And those are the three biggest moments that I remember that I was hit by during that time.
Well, thank you all for sharing those stories. We are kind of coming to the close of the hour now, and 1 hour is by far not even the tip of the iceberg to sum up John Romita's legacy, influence, body of work, any of that. But I want to thank you all again for taking the time out. Obviously, this was not a planned event, so thank you for coming out. I know Joey said that he intends to kind of hang back a little bit, so if anyone, you know, who wasn't comfortable sharing earlier or just wants to say something private, can give a message, you know, to express condolences, whatever, to your family, and he'll pass those messages along. And Aaron, I don't know, are you going to hang back a little bit if folks want to, there's much more, you know, he's held up some, I walked around with some, but if you want to take a look at some of Aaron's collection that he owns. But thank you all again for being here. Thank you all for attending.